It's a Wednesday afternoon in a small town in Malawi. Under the shade of a mango tree, neighbors gather on wooden benches for their weekly community meeting. They discuss everything from rising food prices to how to fix the village borehole. Across the continent, in Nairobi, a group of young protesters march through the city streets, chanting for accountability and the end to corruption. Two different scenes, a quiet morning in a rural village and a noisy protest in a capital city, yet both reveal something powerful: democracy in action. We often think of democracy as something that happens at the ballot box, a single day every few years when citizens line up to cast their votes. But what if democracy is also happening every day, in spaces big and small, wherever citizens decide to act together? Welcome to Voices Africa, a podcast from Afrobarometer, where we explore how ordinary people shape democracy across the continent. I'm your host, Shannon van Veekosa. Afrobarometer's 2025 flagship report on citizen engagement reveals that 94% of Africans participate in at least one form of civic or political activity. 94%? That's nearly everyone. And participation isn't limited to elections. People attend community meetings, contact leaders, join civic groups, discuss politics, volunteer, and sometimes take to the streets. In this episode, we ask, what does it really mean to participate in democracy? And how do Africa's civic engagement traditions, from barazas in Kenya to khutlas in Botswana, continue to shape how people engage today? Before we dive deeper, a quick note about who we are and where these insights come from. Afrobarometer is a pan-African research network that has, for more than 2 decades, worked to amplify the voices of ordinary Africans. Through nationally representative surveys across about 40 African countries, Afrobarometer collects reliable data on citizens' thoughts, experiences, and preferences on a wide range of issues that affect their lives. We share our findings in publications, reports, news releases, and social media posts so that people's voices can become part of evidence-based policy and decision-making. Our 2025 flagship report, which informs this podcast series, focuses on how people participate in democracy. It captures the full spectrum of participation, from voting and contacting leaders to community meetings, protests, and online activism. In eastern Kenya, the baraza is a centuries-old institution, a community gathering where residents meet to discuss issues and resolve conflicts. It's open to everyone, elders and youth, men and women. For many people, it's the first and sometimes only place where they feel their voices are heard. Hundreds of kilometers away, in Botswana, the khutla serves a similar purpose. Citizens gather with their chief to air concerns and hold leaders accountable. It's an ancient practice, but one that continues to inspire modern notions of public participation.
At Afrobarometer, when we ask people across Africa how they engage in democracy, we find that these traditional spaces remain deeply meaningful. They're participatory, deliberative, and accessible, qualities that formal political systems often struggle to achieve.
While policymakers often equate participation with voting or membership in a political party, most Africans view it differently. Participation is about presence, showing up, speaking out, lending a hand. It can happen under a tree, in a church hall, or through a protest march. It's these everyday acts of involvement that sustain the fabric of democracy. To help us understand what these different forms of engagement tell us about democracy in Africa, I spoke to Dr. Stembile Mbete, a political scientist and executive director of the Public Affairs Research Institute in South Africa. Stembile has 15 years of experience working across academia, civil society, and government. She leads the Public Affairs Research Institute, an institution focused on building democratic and effective state institutions in South Africa. She holds a DPhil in International Relations from the University of Pretoria, where she previously served as a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences. Stembile also frequently comments on political developments in South Africa and globally, with her analysis appearing in outlets such as the Financial Times, the New York Times, Al Jazeera, BBC World News, CNN, SABC, Newsroom Africa, and Voice of America. Dr. Mbete, thank you for joining us on the first episode of the Voices Africa podcast. Afrobarometer finds that almost every African engages in some form of civic or political activity. Why do you think this participation is so vibrant?
Look, I think that a big part of it is that we've got a very youthful population. We've got 70% of Africans are under the age of 30. And I think that there is a great deal of energy and youthful kind of exuberance on the continent that is harnessed in a wide range of ways. Secondly, is that because there are so many of the formal systems of participation, voting, running for office, starting a political party or running for office, are often so exclusionary to young people that people find all sorts of other ways to be involved. So yes, we focus often on electoral participation, as the Afrobarometer report showed. The year of elections in 2024 was really important for that. But people are also involved in politics in all sorts of other ways and make space for themselves to be engaged in politics when those systems are exclusionary or more difficult to participate in. And so, organizing meetings, protesting, which is a big thing in many regions, try to engage directly with leadership in different ways and take ways of collective action to solve problems that people face, are also ways in which people are engaging very actively that often don't get seen as legitimate, so to speak, ways of political engagement, but I think are really, really important.
So I want to drill down on the point you've made. And if you can just give us some examples of the forms of participation that are often overlooked by policymakers or the media.
So I think protest is often overlooked in terms of its legitimacy as a form of participation, that informal participation mechanisms of trying to be heard in between election cycles, which is often when you see protest being used, or to be heard when formal mechanisms have failed in hearing people's grievances. I think what gets overlooked often is that you often have protest being used in peaceful ways for a long time before it turns into revolution or into violent mechanisms. You've seen that certainly in South Africa, that you have, multiple protests that take place daily. Very often, only a fraction of them are recorded in the news or recorded by the media. So the difference between media-recorded protests and those that are recorded by the police that happen in different places, there's a big difference, about tenfold difference in the protests that are happening daily in small communities trying to be heard by their elected leadership. If you looked at what happened in Madagascar also, that you'd had engagement by young people in very different ways and very small ways over time, and that then erupted into a much bigger conflagration later. The other ways that are often overlooked are more traditional ways of engagement. Something that got mentioned in the Afrobarometer report of the barazas and khutlas and these traditional forms of engagement that are harnessed and that form a very important function for communities in order to engage in problem solving of their issues outside of the formally recognized mechanisms. And then, of course, I think trying to engage directly with leaders. And I think this is particularly important given that in our systems, a lot of those relationships of direct political contact aren't measured or aren't measurable in many ways, that I think are a very important way of engagement and a very important way of ways that people try to solve their daily challenges and deal with their daily lived experience.
So you mentioned the traditional forums of civic engagement, such as barazas and khotlas, and how they still shape civic life today. Could you let us know what that tells you about the strength or the weakness of democratic culture on the continent?
I think that the way that we think of traditional forms of engagement, I think has been so narrow over time, and that we haven't really engaged with them as ways of legitimate democratic engagement and legitimate democratic forums. And I think that that is a weakness in the way that we talk about democratic culture in the continent, because the ways in which we think of what is legitimate democratic participation is often the transplant of how democratic participation, town hall meetings, for example, from the United States, that sort of culture of political participation or democratic participation being seen as the more legitimate one, and not seeing something like a baraza or a khota as just another mechanism that is equally legitimate of political engagement, of democratic engagement. I think that if we counted these other forms of traditional engagement as equally democratic, as equally legitimate, then we would see our democratic cultures as being much stronger and as thriving than if we discount those mechanisms of engagement as being legitimate political participation or legitimate democratic participation. And so I think that's the one thing. I think that the second thing, though, and which I guess is one of the things that people call into question about the strength or the power of those traditional forums, is the extent to which they are exclusionary of particular groups in society, and the way in which they reinforce particular power relations within communities and traditional power relations within communities. But nevertheless, I think that a much broader view of what legitimate political and democratic participation is a necessary step to being able to really engage with the reality of how Africans view democracy, but also participate in the governance of their daily lives.
So, building on what you've just said, in your view, what role does local government then play in sustaining that day-to-day engagement?
I think local government is critical to sustaining day-to-day engagement. And so local government issues are often the ones that are most tied to people's day-to-day existence and their day-to-day lives. Local leadership should be the closest level to the people and should be the most accessible to people. But what we do know is that there's many parts of the continent where local leaders can sometimes be the most inaccessible to people. And so often people have MPs who fill the void that's left, or the gap that is left by local councillors. But local government should be the place at which people's day-to-day well-being is the most engaged with, and that those leaders should be the ones that people have the most access to. In the Afrobarometer report, for example, there were a number of countries where people seem to have greater access to national level leadership than they did to local leadership. But I think that there's a vast number of more countries where people had the highest contact with their local leaders. And I think that this is the way that it should be, where your daily issues that affect your material life are those that you should be able to have greater engagement with around your leaders. And so both local government councillors and traditional leaders, I think, are very, very important in helping people to deal with those issues of everyday well-being.
Dr. Mbete, in terms of that engagement, how can governments and CSOs better support informal or community-based engagement?
Look, I think that there's an important role that CSOs have to play in supporting local level leadership and local level leaders. So much of the way that we talk about governance tends to focus on the national level and doesn't take into account how important local level leadership and ways of engagement are. And so shifting some of that focus to the subnational level, I think, is an important thing, and is something that this report opens up the space to do or provides the data and the language to support it. I think the second thing is to think about creating the mechanisms for more routine engagement between communities at a local level and their leaders. And so a lot around contacting leadership that is spoken about in the report for a great number of countries is finding assistance with solving personal problems or community problems or jobs, which is a huge issue for youth. But I think, thinking more deliberately about what are the routine mechanisms of engagement, whether those are routine community meetings, what are the ways of public participation that are more formalized and more routine that could take place at a local level that will strengthen that daily democratic engagement beyond just the engagement that we see happening and we see often reported on. And then lastly, I think the ways of civic education around the options for civic engagement at different levels, I think is a really important thing. We know that people are engaging on a daily level, but often people engage outside of the formal systems that potentially exist because they don't know sufficiently enough about them. And so I think, continued civic training and civic education and working with organized groupings where they exist, particularly at a local level, is something that CSOs more broadly, but those who support CSOs with funding and with capacity building and other ways of resource mobilization can pay attention in order to continue strengthening democratic participation.
I want to close off our discussion and just kind of go back to the point that you've made about daily democratic engagement. So would you be able to share a story or an example that embodies Africa's everyday democracy? So what are those moments when ordinary citizens, through small but powerful acts, shape decisions or hold leaders accountable?
I think in the context that I know, best here in South Africa, I think the ways that we've seen communities try to address their service delivery problems and challenges at a local level. So everything from engaging with councillors and with local government about fixing electricity provision or water provision or, their challenges of access. And there's some research that we've done at Parry about how people are trying to solve, and these are working class communities that are solving some of the problems that they have at a local level and working with councillors, working with ward committees to be able to do that, I think is a really big example of people trying to address the bigger problems by organizing themselves and engaging with municipalities on a unified basis. I think that what we've seen that has led to revolution and change in a number of different contexts, most recently in Madagascar, has been the way in which particularly young people have organized with each other. What you saw in Kenya around the government's finance bill and against corruption, the way in which we saw young people use the technology that's available to them, but also good old-fashioned being on the street protesting in order to not only educate themselves and each other on what was at stake with the different pieces of legislation, but also then to educate and to inform each other about the ways to resist it, I think is an example of this daily democratic engagement that eventually leads to change. I think that the ways in which communities in different places are using their traditional mechanisms, which we've already spoken about, of meeting in order to organize collective action amongst themselves. So attending a community meeting, attending a khotla, and then out of that saying, well, then what do we need to do together in order to change or to impact on a particular problem or a challenge that we face? And I think that what's important, moving on from this research that has been done about how people participate through various democratic forums, is that the big gap, of course, is the responsiveness of the state, the responsiveness of politicians, the responsiveness of state officials, that It's a two-way relationship that you not only want to have the signs and the evidence of how people are participating and democratically engaging, but then the question of then how is that engagement responded to by the people with the power to make the decisions that actually change people's lives, I think is an area of focus that we need to continuously focus on. And I think Tunisia is such an instructive example from the report, where a lot of people, given the experience that Tunisia has had since the Arab Spring, had basically given up on a lot of engagement with political leaders. And there's this withdrawal from the system because of the frustration of the authoritarian kind of responses to protest and the various political crises that the country has faced. And so you can't just have people engage and participate in a vacuum. We need to have the system respond to that engagement in some way for it to be meaningful.
Listening to these stories, one thing becomes clear. Democracy isn't an event, it's a habit. Across Africa, from the rural councils of Malawi to the civic networks of Accra, people are keeping democracy alive through everyday acts of participation. They attend meetings, they volunteer, they raise questions, they organize. These actions may seem small, but together they form the lifeblood of accountable governance. Democracy at its core depends not just on institutions, but on people's beliefs that their voices matter. And in Africa, those voices, in all of their diversity, are speaking loud and clear. I'm Shannon van Wyk Kossa, and this has been Voices Africa, a podcast from Afrobarometer. Join us next time as we explore how economic hardship can spark, rather than silence, civic action. To read Afrobarometer's full 2025 flagship report on citizen engagement, visit afrobarometer.org.